Well, so phi naught of phi 1 of 2 omega naught 3 was pretty mind-blowing. Went into that in some detail. Again, even though we're going to go way, way, way beyond that, and I'll kind of alternate a little bit of a high level and these kind of zoom into the fractal kind of things, which I just kind of like, and give you a little bit of a more visceral sense of like what this is doing. Um, so we could, of course, the simplest thing to do is just increase the input, just fix that function, and just increase the input. That would get a bit silly, but they will be so much. The expansion process will be so much more intricate, and the values you get are going to be so incredibly larger. This is a very, very, very fast growing function, but we want to continue on our journey. We've seen a lot of the basic patterns. So I'd say don't very much at the start of the journey. We haven't done um, anywhere near the power that we're going to get to toward the end, but we have seen a lot of the basic patterns of how iteration and sort of recursive iteration, and you do this amazingly huge function a huge number of times, and then because you're cycling that back into the same kind of function, it's going to expand out in terms of the lower functions in this unbelievably huge way. And then that gets cycled back, and then it's based on the lower functions in an unbelievably huge way. So, but let's go back to just the level of what's really going to create some of the power here is the arithmetic we're doing not on this input, this number, but the arithmetic we're doing at the big omega 1 level of these function gadgets. And in other words, this function phi 1. Remember, it's exactly analogous to f. It really is the same idea, but just in this slightly more complicated context. The 0th version of phi 1 is just successor. And every time you put a successor tag on the control input of phi 1, it just says iterate the previous one, phi 1 at the alpha level, beta times on beta. And one of the crucial things we saw is that makes sense. Okay, so there's much more to see, even in that direction. But you might have a question already. Well, what really created the power of phi naught, our original fast-growing function f, or sequence of functions f, was the diagonalization combined with the successor that created recursive iteration. So is there a gadget that diagonalizes here? Remember, what was the diagonalization? Phi naught with omega naught, that was the simplest diagonalizer. It let the input slot duplicate itself into the control slot. And more generally, we've been seeing some examples where alpha was a little more complicated. Things that like omega naught 4, omega naught 8, things like that. Nothing super complicated yet. It allows the n to go into that and basically choose and ratchet up the complexity of the control in ways that can get pretty impressive. So is there a similar thing for omega 1, for the phi 1 function? Yes. The simplest one is just omega 1, which is the identity function on big omega 1. It's going to be exact analog of little omega naught, which was the identity function on the integers. So it turns out that's going to be the founding element of a new level of gadget called big omega 2. So I wanted to recognize, in case people are like, oh, is that the next thing? It's coming, and it'll be a big, big deal. But we still want to work up to that, because as soon as we start using this in any significant way, it's going to refer down to a lot of very, very powerful stuff at the level where we're not in the big omega 2 level, where we need to really figure out more fancy arithmetic on phi 1 level arithmetic on omega naught, because that's going to be how the next level of diagonalization will have to unpack. So we're not quite ready for that. So next thing, obviously, hey, let's just take a look at least a bit at phi 1 of 3, comma omega naught. Turns out this connects to a very famous level when we express this in a little more traditional way with ordinary ordinals, and I'll mention that in a little bit. If you're an expert in that, you'll probably be able to see what level we're at. So by definition, of course, the 3 level of the phi1 function acting on anything, but the simplest input and the best input for us is just omega naught. That's going to be take that 2 level, which we experimented with just a little bit, and iterate it omega naught times on omega naught. In other words, when we take this function we just created and input an n, an integer n, it just means iterate it that many times. So nothing super complicated. Okay, so let's see that in action. As usual, the way we are going to be using these is inside of phi naught, inside the control argument. So we take phi1 of 3 comma omega naught. We're going to put it in a phi naught, and we're just going to put a 2 in here. I know that might seem like, oh, that's somehow that's going to be degenerate or not representative. Well, it doesn't represent the full power of these things, but it's more comprehensible, and it's a good place to start. Okay, so what does that do? We're going to put, it means repeat the phi1 of 2 function, omega naught times, and that immediately just brings in the 2 and does that 2 times. So again, not anything ridiculously huge right now in this slot, but it's still fairly significant. So we take omega naught and we do the phi1 of 2 dot once, which is double it omega naught times, and then take that whole thing and double it that many times. And so we've already got an iterated exponential of function gadgets, things that live in big omega 1. This is quite similar to fairly standard ordinal arithmetic on little omega, no subscript. It's not exactly the same, though, and I'm going to unpack it according to the rules of these function gadgets. And that's what it's going to be. There's going to be, if you know ordinary ordinal arithmetic, you're going to want to simplify this in a way that's not correct for these versions, these tree ordinals that we're secretly using here. Okay, so the way it unpacks is you look for the most exponentified omega naught. That's the one that is the open slot that is going to take this 2 in here. I could go ahead and write that out just in terms of the rules for phi naught of 2, in terms of phi naught of 1, in terms of phi naught of 0. It gets a little tedious to do that when you work out those rules. And again, it's just these 2 rules. That's all you need. When you work that out, and the definition, the careful definition of what does it mean to iterate, like omega naught times, things like that. When you work that out, it just means you can write these as exponentials, and that when you have exponentials involving functions and you're ready to put a number into this gadget, these kinds of gadgets, you ratchet up and you first plug into the highest level of exponent. Okay, and then of course 2 to the 2 is just 4, so this is just an omega naught 4 as the exponent. Okay, that is still a function. That is not a successor. I need to get it down eventually to where it's a successor. And then the rule for successors in the control slot is going to take over. So this is still a function. It's still got an omega naught that I can expand. So I just attack this guy. Oh, omega naught 4. Yeah, we've done that. The 2 level of that is just omega naught 3 plus 2. Because omega naught 4 is a code for just the sequence of all things of the form omega naught 3 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. And this is going, because this is still a 2 in this slot that we're using is for the diagonalization trick, that's going to show up in that sequence. Okay, so we're getting a little bit more pedestrian here, just slightly. Okay, again, you can show, and you can do it completely in the phi1 language if you want, but it ends up being just one of our most standard rules of exponents is that when I have a sum and an exponent like that, it turns into just that, the 2 to the omega naught 3, and then times 2 to the 2, which is 4. But of course, remember, this is also multiplying all this stuff. Okay, so just kind of practice with the basic arithmetic of these tree ordinals. And again, you can leave a comment if you want to see kind of this stuff written out absolutely religiously, only using the phi naught of 2 dot and phi naught of 1 dot. I can do it. it gets a little bit, it's just bigger on the page. But it can be, leave a comment if you want. Okay, so what's this guy? Let's see. This is, I'm multiplying this complicated gadget by 4. So that's multiplying it by 3, and then adding one more. Okay, so that's just literally saying something, 4 copies of something is 3 copies of something plus 1 copy of something. That doesn't do much, but it then says, okay, this now, the last thing I have is an exponent level. Okay, I know what to do with that. I feed the 2 into that exponent level. Omega naught 3 is just code for a sequence of omega naught 2 plus integers. I get the second element in that sequence. Okay, I've done some unpacking. Okay, so now same deal happens. So I've got all of this stuff and then just times of 4 from that rule of exponents, which does work here. Okay, same deal can be done here. This all is something times 4, so it's going to be that stuff times 3 plus itself. And now I've got another exponent that I can unpack. Okay, this is looking promising. And so omega naught 2, that turns into omega naught plus 2. Then that spits off a times 4. And that means I can say, oh, it's this stuff times 3 plus another copy. That's what I've got here. Notice how it's expanding out. This is a very typical thing. Expanding, expanding, expanding. Getting more, bigger on the page, more explicit, but the leading edge is getting eroded in complexity as we go. Okay, now that omega naught, that just turns into a straight up 2 in the exponent. So this turns into a 4. Okay. And now it's just multiplied by this omega naught plus times 2 to the omega naught. Okay, not quite as intimidating. But notice I'm leaving all this residue here. This guy is going to stay around for a long, long, long time and is going to be these bombs waiting to detonate. And so is this guy. It's going to stay around for almost as long, and those are going to be really, really important. Okay, so let's see. We got the handle of this. That's 4 copies of something. That's 3 copies of the same thing plus 1 copy. That 1 copy has an exponent in it. That turns into 2 to the 2, which is 4. Then that's 4 copies of something. That's omega naught times 3 plus 1 omega naught. That actually turns into a 2. Oh my God, we're at a successor. So now something different is going to happen. This is no longer a unmarked function. It has the successor markers, it has 2 of them, and so something different is going to happen. So this is getting pretty big on the page. So let's abbreviate all of this stuff without the plus 2 as alpha. That is a function gadget, and I want to abbreviate that. Okay, so here's what alpha is. It's all of the stuff. Notice that kind of decent level of kind of expansion on the page. And then what I'm really doing is phi naught of alpha plus 2 with the 2 input. Okay, what is that? Well, now we use the rule for successor. That's alpha plus 1, the alpha plus 1 level applied twice on 2. And of course, if this had been this is bigger than a 2, I would apply it a lot more times. But, you know, you got to walk before you can run. So what does that mean? I'm going to take that alpha plus 1 level. That's going to be in terms of the alpha level applied this many times on itself. Okay, that's also a successor, but with a pretty small input. Okay, that's phi naught of the alpha level again, applied twice on 2. Okay, now I'm going to just dive into that iteration exponent once again. Now here, I'm going to dive in not only into the iteration exponent, but just into the first part, first stage of the 2 stages that you have to do to calculate that iteration exponent. Just this guy, not even the whole iteration exponent. What is that? Well, that's where I got to unpack alpha again. So I bring back alpha. Okay, boom, wow, okay. Now that's going to start eroding. Okay, that's an omega naught times 3. Okay, that's an omega naught times 2 plus omega naught, and I've gone ahead and done 2 steps in one, because that turns into a 2 right away. Okay, so let's call this stuff beta. So this is going to be phi naught of beta plus 2 with a 2 input. Okay, so there's my definition of beta. Okay, now that's phi naught of beta plus 1 applied twice on 2. That's phi naught of just straight up beta applied this many times. on itself. Let's expand that out. That's phi naught of beta on phi naught of beta 2. Okay. And now let's dive in again. Phi naught of beta comma 2. Again, that's not even the whole iteration exponent. That's just the first stage of calculating the iteration exponent. Let's put back in the whole full glorious version of beta. That subcalculation uses the omega naught times 2. That breaks into an omega naught plus omega naught, and then it diagonalizes to be an omega naught plus 2. Whew. Okay. And then we're going to call this guy gamma, and then we're going to do it again. Okay, let's see. What's the pattern here? As we erode that original, the first time we got a successor, we call it alpha plus 2. Each time we hit successors, we pass into the iteration exponent. So we're going to end up with a huge stack of iteration upon iteration upon iteration. Let me just show you that stack, and I think I'm going to continue this in the next video. So here's our original calculation. So here's how I'm going to write that. It's this function, the phi naught alpha dot level, raised to the power of absolutely everything that is indented past that. And inside that iteration exponent, there was one more application of phi naught of alpha dot of, okay, and then that was, the rest of it was phi naught of alpha comma 2. But then that unpacked as phi naught of beta dot raised to the power of everything that's further indented, which is phi naught of beta dot one more time, applied to phi naught of gamma dot, which is the next version stripping off successors, raised to the power of one more application of phi naught of gamma dot of phi naught of delta. That's going to be the next thing as we erode this pattern. I'll show the pattern probably in the next video. Raised to the power of, etc., 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 etc. Eventually, that thing's going to erode down to omega naught times 2 to the omega naught, raised to the power of phi naught of omega naught times 2 to the omega naught of phi naught of omega naught times 2 to the omega naught to the 2 of 2, and that will immediately erode to a 2 to the 2, and we're finally down to at least this guy is something that we're kind of familiar with. But then, of course, that will go into there. And that is way beyond anything we did at all explicitly before. And that is the iteration exponent on another version of omega naught times 2 to the omega naught, with these guys ready to diagonalize, explode based on these numbers. And then that's the iteration exponent of this stuff with this as its input argument. And that's just way, way deeply nested into this whole tower of iterations. And then that goes out, 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 out. And then what's some of the last levels? We got this phi naught of, it was phi naught of delta of all this stuff. And that was the iteration exponent on another phi naught of delta level with input this guy. And then that with another phi naught of gamma, which is a more powerful gadget. And that was the iteration exponent of another phi naught of gamma raised to all this power, acting on a gamma plus 1. And then that was put into a beta level, and that was put in the alpha level. And the outer level that's the input. And the iteration exponent was all this stuff as the iteration exponent on an alpha level phi naught. Whew. And remember, even this guy, even this is this kind of the least, in some sense, the least important part of this guy. It's just the original input number. But even that guy has a completely similar expansion. To actually start understanding this guy, you have to write down pretty much the same expansion, which has this input beta plus 1. And even to understand just the input number of that guy, you have to expand this guy out, and it goes, and it goes, and it goes, and it goes, and it goes. Okay. Okay, actually, let me stop and end this with just, I wrote out very explicitly, like, what are these gadgets that go into the first slots as you go to iteration exponent to iteration exponent? And I'm just going to scroll through. You can pause on this just to get a sense of the pattern. I did not do the whole thing. I could have, but it would be a kind of a waste of my time. You can see it kind of erodes, And then it does kind of gets physically bigger on the page at some stages, and it rebounds, and then it erodes and erodes, and then it gets a little bit bigger on the page. But at every stage, the complexity of whatever we're eating away does eventually go down. And so eventually this really does terminate in a much smaller, simpler gadget. But you can see, and that's only part of it. I mean, this would be a lot more to write. Actually, I don't know if it actually would. This might, yeah, actually, this would put me on the hook for something that might take my entire life. We're getting towards that level at any rate. Okay. So that is a pretty big deal. Definitely a long video, so let me cut it here.